These kids in high school, in junior high, in middle school, as early as elementary school, are getting messages in our environment that certain people matter more, that the achievers matter more in this modern, that you're only as good as your next achievement, you're only as good as your GPA. And these messages are not developmentally appropriate for young people. They are developing their sense of self, they're building out who they are. And this time is critically important for helping them develop a sturdy sense of self, not one that is contingent on performance or how we look or how popular we are on social media.
Jennifer Wallace is an award-winning journalist and social commentator covering parenting and lifestyle trends. She's a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and appears on television to discuss her articles and other hot topics in the news. Jenny's also the author of the book, Never Enough: When Achievement Pressure Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It, the definitive book on the rise of toxic achievement culture overtaking our kids' and parents' lives and the new framework for fighting back. I love all the tips and tricks that Jenny shares on today's podcast, and I'm so excited to share this one with you guys. All right, Jenny, welcome to the podcast. I know we had a little chat before it started. I've just been so looking forward to this interview. I think that the work that you've done in the book that you've written, Never Enough, is just it's a reminder for all of us young moms and then moms who have junior high students, just going into high school, like the pressure that our children are under and how we can kind of just get in that rat race with our friends. And I'm so happy you're here to talk about the research. And I just can't thank you enough for your time.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad the book is resonating. It was, they call it in when researchers study a topic that's near and dear, they call it MeSearch. And I would say this book is very much a MeSearch project.
Well, let's jump into that. Why was this book a MeSearch project for you? Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your life?
Great. So I'm the mother of three teenagers. I have an 18-year-old, I have a 16 and a 13. And I've been noticing over the years just how different my kids' childhood was from mine growing up. Achievement and success were important to me. It was important to my parents, but it didn't define my childhood the way it seems to for so many young people today, that they are only as good as their next performance. They're only as good as their GPA or their test scores. And I wanted to know, how did we get to this place? And then what could I do in my own home to buffer against this excessive pressure?
Yeah. I mean, the pressure does feel like it's surmounting and it's anxiety provoking and it has kids spending too many hours awake and outside of nature and outside of play and fun. So when you looked into the research, what were some of the aha moments for you?
Yeah, so I wanted to figure out what were the roots of this. And so I spoke with historians and anthropologists and sociologists and psychologists, and I get into a teeny bit in the book. But what the story that resonated most with me was what I call the economic story. So when I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s, life was generally more affordable.
Mhm.
Housing, healthcare, higher education, these things were all more affordable than they are today. And so parents like mine could be relatively assured that even with a B minus in AP calculus, even with some setbacks, that most likely I'd be able to replicate my own childhood financially as an adult, if not do even better than my own parents did. Because that's always been the American dream, to not just do as well as your parents, but to do better than your parents. But today's modern parents are facing a different reality. We are seeing the first generation, the millennials, who are not doing as well as their parents on average. We are, as parents, we're feeling the crush of the middle class. We're seeing the steep inequity that's been ushered in over the last few decades. And whether we're aware of it or not, we parents are absorbing these macro forces, these macroeconomic forces in our environment. We're internalizing them, and it's coming out in the way that we parent. This is not to blame parents. I wrote this book because I was so tired of all the blaming with parents. The pressures we are feeling that you just described are bigger than any one family and any one school and any one community. And there's a better way. So what I hope with this book, at the very least, is for parents to feel seen in the pages, to feel like the anxieties and the pressures that are keeping them up at night and making them question their parenting, that they're not alone in this and that it is a shift that's taken place and that there are ways to counter it.
So when you think about these surmounting pressures and you think about what is really driving our behavior as parents, I mean, we don't want to have that guilt, but we also don't want to act in a way that passes that pressure down on our kids. I think about it almost like a business where the boss may be stressed from his boss, but if he has the ability to create a ceiling or like a buffer or barrier between him and his boss, he can encourage and he can allow for the space and development of an employee to really excel. And it's kind of how I think. I'm an entrepreneur, so it's kind of how I think about it with my kids. Like, how do I protect them from this? And what is kind of seeping into my psyche that makes me think, oh, I'm stressed out about this. You talk about status as something in the book. Can you talk about those sort of unnamed pressures that we are feeling as parents that's creating this behavior in our home?
So, when it comes to status, whether we're aware of it or not, we have all inherited the importance of status, or so we think it's important,
Yeah.
because to our evolutionary ancestors, status mattered, right? Status back in the when we were tribes and bands, the person with high status got the best cut of meat, had more mating opportunities, was able to go to the higher ground, was less likely to be out in the savannah getting killed. And so, we've inherited this drive for status. But unfortunately, in our modern society, our kids are not going to die or get eaten by the lions if they get a C+ in chemistry. But we are wired to feel like that, right? No parent wants their kids to suffer from what researchers call a status descent, meaning going from, you know, being a good student to dropping down. And so we can get activated in ways that are not necessarily in our kids' best interests or in our best interests when that status signal is getting activated. So we are absorbing these. We are wired to feel these things. We are wired to look for status. But I'm here to tell you that it's a misfire in today's world, and it can make us act in ways that are not in our best interest.
I mean, I can just feel that as someone with a social media presence. I think that's a good example of like, w- w- it's not even real. I mean, it is that we're like, I'm building a community, but it is it, it is interesting to have growth or stagnation. And you can think about it like, for me, maybe in grades, like I loved getting a tutor for geometry and becoming really good at it. But I definitely have had classes where I had good grades and the drop it feels scary
Mhm.
and stressful. And you're also activated from a scarcity mindset and a fear. You're acting out of a place of fear. Can you talk about how that can impact our psyche?
Yeah. So when researchers look at scarcity in the brain, what it does is it narrows our vision. So, again, back to our earliest ancestors, the reason that we respond to scarcity was because when we were out in the savannah, if we were short on food or water, that was a signal that we better get off our butts and go find the food and water or we're going to die.
Mhm.
Scarcity today, we've inherited that feeling of seeing things that really aren't real scarcity, but they feel like they are. And so it can hijack our brains and it can motivate us in negative ways. So I'll give you just like a little example. Let's say you have a child in high school who is playing soccer and you are banking on a soccer scholarship, or to get them into a more elite school, for their soccer. So how might scarcity affect you on the sidelines? Well, if your son isn't getting played and you know the scout is out there, or you're looking to improve his stats, the scarcity is lighting up in your brain and you're like, oh my gosh, he's not getting the shot that he needs, not getting the chance that he needs. So what might you do to squash that painful feeling? Because status and scarcity, they hijack our brain and it's very painful. It's literally a painful feeling to feel a status drop or to feel scarcity in the environment, because it's painful because through evolution, we were wired to pay attention to that pain so
Mhm.
that we could treat it. And
I
so what it might do on the sidelines is it might mean yelling at your kid's soccer coach, which would not be great and not be good modeling for our kids, also not in their long-term interest to be the loudmouth on the sidelines saying, "My kid needs to get in."
Mhm.
But those are the kinds of motivations that status and scarcity could trigger in us. And so, what is wonderful about being a human is that we can have emotional intelligence. We can give ourselves the space. We can feel the status light up. We can feel the scarcity in our brains. We can feel the pain, and we can take a pause and we can choose the action that is in our long term interest. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
It makes perfect sense to me, and I think for most parents, if you're on the sideline and you're having that immediate response to scream or yell or talk to the coach, it doesn't feel right. I'm sure after it's over, it's that moment again where, like, you're feeling guilty as a parent that you didn't show up in the way that you would wanna show up. I kinda wanna address this kind of elephant in the room, which is we're talking about scarcity and we're talking about status. And this book was written and is talking about a community that is very privileged. Um, but can you talk about why that still really matters? You
Yeah.
had a stat that said in 2019, 1 in 3 high school students and half of female students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, an overall increase of 40% from 2009.
So the reason that I wrote this book was because in 2019 I wrote an article for the Washington Post. And the article was covering two national policy reports. And these are really critical reports. These are by the world's, the country's leading developmental researchers. And the reason these reports are important is because government policy is set based on reports like these. And the researchers named a new at-risk group. So they were naming kids who were not doing well compared to the average American teen. They were looking at kids living in poverty. They were looking at kids with incarcerated parents. They were looking at recent immigrants. They were looking at children living in foster care. All four of those kids are at risk for having negative health outcomes. They named a new group in 2019, students attending what researchers call high achieving schools. Those are public and private schools around the country where the kids generally go off to competitive four-year colleges. Those kids, those schools generally have rich extracurricular activities and advanced placement classes. And what the researchers were finding was that those kids, as many as 1 in 3, um, as I point out in the book from a researcher, as many as 1 in 3 kids are under this excessive pressure to achieve, which is making them 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. And these are not just issues in high school. So, one sociologist that I quote in the book says, "What gets in early gets in deep." These kids in high school, in junior high, in middle school, as early as elementary school, are getting messages in our environment that certain people matter more, that the achievers matter more in this modern, that you're only as good as your next achievement, you're only as good as your GPA. And these messages are not developmentally appropriate for young people. They are developing their sense of self, they're building out who they are. And this time is critically important for helping them develop a sturdy sense of self, not one that is contingent on performance or how we look or how popular we are on social media. So the reason I'm looking at these kids, these schools generally cater to the top 20 to 25% of household incomes. So depending on where you live, that's roughly 130,000 or more. So we're talking about two teachers. We're talking about a builder. We're talking about nurses. We're not talking about CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and their kids. These are 1 in 3 adolescents are maybe at an increased risk.
Oh, it I know that I'm in postpartum. I'm in 8 months postpartum, but it makes me really emotional because at what cost? Like when I think about dear friends, and family members who have, struggled with anxiety and depression and overwhelm from just modern competition in life, I think at what cost? Like there's so much pain there. And if all of that was stripped away, like how much success and how much abundance and how much love and support they could create in this world for their neighbors and their friends and their family. And this is just it can be such a beautiful life with gratitude for what we have and our all of our strengths, but I when we get in that narrow vision of scarcity and competition and it's almost that survival, fight or flight. th- there's no ability to create that, and I just see so much opportunity, and it breaks my heart. And I really don't wanna be that way as a parent, and I know that I can feel that it instinctually, when you get into the grind, could be an automatic response. So, what I mean, you've done surveys, you've looked at the research, you've made connections with over 200 people in diverse groups, like, what can we do? Like, I help me before I before I mess it up, you know? I don't
Yeah.
I don't I mean, I even think like Sebastian, my oldest, he loves sports, like every sport wants to do it all the time. And you even said the youth sports industry increased by 55% from 2010 to 2017. It constitutes 19 billion. It's been one research organization that focuses on youth sports projects that this total will climb to 77 billion by 2026. The intensity of kids' sports has shifted. Like, what? We're even making them that's supposed to be fun and play, and now it's a point of stress. What are we doing wrong? Like, how can we stop this runaway train?
Right. So both as a mother, but also as a researcher, I went in search of the kids who were doing well despite the pressure. I wanted to study them. I wanted to know what, if anything, they had in common. What was home life like? What did their parents focus on at home? What were their mindsets, their behaviors? What was school like? What were their relationships like with their peers? And I get into the healthy strivers, as I call them. I get into the various aspects in the book, but it boiled down to this idea that the kids who were doing well, despite the pressure, felt like they mattered for who they were deep inside, away from their achievements, away from their successes. Mattering is not my idea. Mattering is an idea that's been studied since the 1980s, but it's been locked away in the ivory tower. And so this is the first book to bring it into the hands of parents who can use it. So mattering acts like a protective shield. It didn't mean that the students that I met who were thriving didn't have setbacks. They had moments when they failed, they had missteps, they felt bad, they were stressed. But what mattering did is it acted like a kind of buoy that would lift them up. Setbacks and failures were not an indictment of who they were as people. The kids I met who were struggling the most generally fell into two camps. One was they felt like they mattered only when they achieved. So they only mattered when. And the other group of kids felt like they mattered to their parents. Their parents told them they mattered. They felt valued at home, but they were never depended on or relied on to add value back to anyone other than themselves. And so, what these kids lacked is what I call in the book social proof that they mattered. They heard it in words, but they didn't see it in action. And so, what mattering is for me, it's become my North Star. And honestly, I'm devoting the rest of my life to mattering. I'm actually now writing a book on adult mattering because I've seen how critical it is. It is at the, if I could just dork out for one more minute on mattering, researchers who study it say that after the drive for food and shelter. It is the instinct to matter that drives human behavior for better and for worse. So when we feel like we matter, we show up to the world in positive ways. We want to give back. We want to perform. We want to do well at school. We want to contribute at home. When we are chronically made to feel like we don't matter, either by society, by our parents, by our schools, three things can happen. We can turn against ourselves, we can become anxious and depressed, turn to substances to temporarily alleviate that feeling, that horrible feeling of not mattering. We can act out in anger. We can say, "Oh, I don't matter. I'll show you I matter." School shooters, domestic terrorists are among the most tragic examples of that. But we could also, in moments where we feel like we don't matter, we can get tools and mindsets to help us matter again. And so in this book, I have the tools of mattering that parents, how they can create cultures of mattering for their kids, how schools can create cultures of mattering, and actually how our wider communities can create these cultures of mattering for our kids.
I love that you're dedicating your life to this because it feels overwhelming for a parent to say, like, well, how do we avoid this? It's everywhere. It's omnipresent. It's on social media. It's on my street. It's in my community. It's at the school. But you have the tools, and I'm so excited to dive into those, and I would love to continue to geek out with you here, because when I think about a student who needs external validation, like their next best thing to matter, it's the like you said, the next test, the next GPA, the next performance. What are the families doing when you look at it that to show up, to show their kids that they matter, um, in the home, and then what can we do in our communities and our schools?
Awesome. So I'll give you, I interviewed so many wise parents, over 200 families, and surveyed 6,500 parents and 500 young adults. And so I have tons of practical advice that these families shared with me and researchers. So one mother that I met had two adolescents, and they were very hard on themselves. She said, they definitely displayed some perfectionistic tendencies. And so when they would come home from school, if they got you know, rejected by a peer group, didn't do well on a test they studied for, didn't make the A team. She would reach into her wallet and she would grab whatever bill she has, 5, 10, 20, whatever was in the wallet. And she would hold it up to her kids and she would say to them, "Do you want this money?" And they'd say, "Yeah, of course." And she'd say, "Okay, hang on." She very dramatically dunked it in a glass of water, dirtied it on the floor. And then she would hold up this soggy, wrinkled, dirty bill. And she would say, "Do you still want this money?" And they would say, "Yes." And she said, "Like your worth, the value of this dollar is like your worth. It doesn't change whether you've been knocked on the ground, whether you've been crumpled up, dirty, wet inside. Your value is your value. It does not change." And what I loved about that, the bill is that it gives, it makes the thinking around unconditional worth visible. That even a wrinkled $20 bill can be, flattened out and you can buy what you would buy with a not crumpled $20 bill. And just like that, our worth doesn't change whether we succeed and our worth doesn't change when we fail. These are temporary setbacks. Our worth is our worth no matter what. So the parents that were raising these healthy strivers were very intentional about the messages they were sending in their homes. And one phrase by a researcher sticks out to me. And this is something I've adopted in my own home. I said to her, her name was Sunya Luthar, and she was one of the world's leading researchers on resilience in this population. And she recently passed away. But when I first interviewed her, I said, "Okay, what can I do tonight in my house?" And she said, "Minimize criticism, prioritize affection." Our kids are getting messages everywhere in the environment. Do more, be better, be prettier, be skinnier. You need the good grades. You need to get into a certain college. That at home, they need a place to recover, a haven from those pressures. And it doesn't mean, again, that mattering and achievement, they are not mutually exclusive. The kids I met who were doing the best, the reason they were going for those big goals, the reason they were reaching for the high things was because they knew they mattered even if they failed. So these kids reached for it versus the other kids who felt like their mattering was contingent. They wouldn't take the extra class that would, test their limits. They held themselves back. So mattering is really a clean motivational fuel. And it's done wonders in my own house. So at home, I would say create a haven from the pressure, be mindful about the messages you're sending. Your kids already know that you want them to be a success. They already know it. They already know it from the environment you have them in, the good schools you've chosen for them, the neighborhoods you're living in. They get what you want. At home, you need to be really holding out the messages that they get in the culture and holding them up and saying, I don't believe this. I don't believe that somebody who loses 10 pounds is more worthy than someone whose, jeans are a little tight. I don't buy it. That's not how we think in our house. So really helping them get that mindset. And at school, I call in the book um, naming the elephant in the room, and that's envy. In these hyper achieving communities where parents have a very narrow definition of what success looks like, kids can feel like their peers are their competition. And the healthy strivers actually had parents who helped them work through their competitive tendencies. They didn't say, don't be competitive. What they did was they helped them foster positive competitive behaviors. And I go into it at depth in the book, and I'll leave you with a little nugget here that when you're feeling envy, these parents would say to their kids, we all feel envy. It's natural. It's part of evolution, right? Envy was something we all inherited. Everyone feels envy. We don't have to hold ourselves accountable for feeling envy, but we do have to hold ourselves accountable for how we act on that envy. So when envy bubbles up in a competitive situation at school, we can take two routes. We can undercut that person so that we feel better by comparison, maybe gossip about them or say they're not that good or whatever. Or we can take the healthier route that actually keeps our relationship strong. We can admire the person. We can say, what did they do? How did they reach that goal? Ask them, say, I am so inspired by you. How did you get there? What did you do? So those are just a couple of tips.
Those are awesome tips. And I think you say in the book, untangle self worth from achievement. And I don't think my parents planned to do that, but I have to give them a shout out because they didn't have this research, but my dad did grow up in this type of a family in Los Angeles, and his brothers were high achieving professionals, a lawyer and an accountant. And my dad was drafted to Vietnam War, and he came back and did community college and got himself into USC for business school and paid his way and struggled. And he struggled in school with his grades. And so when we were little and growing up, because my dad did turn into a risk taking successful entrepreneur, is he always just told us, "Did you try your best?" And he didn't care what the report card looked like. We were afforded, a nice competitive, elephant in the room, like privileged childhood, but it was never competitive in the way that I'm seeing it today. He just would look at our report card and say, "Great job, honey. Did you try your best?" And it was almost worse because it's almost when your parents say, "I'm disappointed." They don't get mad, but "I'm so disappointed," you know? So the grades, I wanna replicate that because I do feel like he did it for me. He untangled my self-worth from my achievement. It wasn't, he was always proud. "I'm always so proud of you, Kel. Good job, honey. Good luck to you, honey." That's like all he would ever say, you know? Um, but he was modeling that you could get horrible grades, that you could not have a linear life of just excelling up, this axis of college, great grades, great career. I mean, he had a career that totally exploded when I was in second grade that I shared with at show and tell that my dad lost his job. Like there were curves and twists and failures, and all I did my whole life was see him fall down and get back up and say, "We got this. It's okay. I'm going to try my best and we'll figure it out." And he was modeling that it was never about his grades. It was about how he tried and the effort he put out. And he has, built a successful career. He's afforded my sisters and I, a wonderful childhood that did have setbacks, that did have, coupon clipping and a living room with no fancy furniture for a number of years and like the regular stuff. But I don't, I really want to pass that down. And I think because my worth wasn't so tied to my outcomes, I feel innately like I have the ability to take risks, to start my own business, to not worry if it would fail. I mean, yes, I did it in a way that I was bootstrapping it, and it was a side hustle. It wasn't so risky, um but I want that for my children because it really is, it allows you to feel worthy of showing up and giving back and finding and pursuing passions and not caring sort of as much about the outside world because you have this inner strength. So outside of tangling self-worth to achievement, like, and I'm going to take the dollar bill, I'm going to crumple it up, my kids are still going to want that money, I know it, because I'd still want that money. But what else can we be doing to really show up and help them matter, help them know that they matter, not just because their parents love them?
Yeah. So I want to tease out two things that your dad did for you. One was model failure, which is so critical and so hard for some parents. We are feeling, and there's research that backs this up, we are feeling the pressure to be perfect as parents. There is so much judgment around us, there's so much judgment. And so modeling failure, I think, is one of the best gifts you could give your kids. And I'll tell you a quick story about that. And then the second thing that your dad did was, well, let me first tell you about the failure. Okay,
Yeah.
so when you talk about failure with your kids, often we think we have to have it all together as parents.
Mm.
And so my daughter was in eighth grade, and she considers herself a good writer, and she got a paperback from her teacher, and it had a lot of red marks on it. She was really upset. And so I marched her over to my desk and I pulled up the first article I'd ever written for the Washington Post. And that was for their science section, a very seasoned editor. She had been there for 30 years. And it was a bloodbath. There were red marks everywhere. And my daughter was like, "Oh my God, you're a professional writer. I can't believe they let you write for them." And I said to her, I was at first embarrassed to need that much help. But then I thought about it and I said, this editor is investing in me. She sees my value and she's helping me. And so that criticism, if you call it that, it was really guidance. And I feel so lucky. So I was modeling for her the failure. The second thing your dad did, which is another thing we can do with our kids, is, are you proud of your work? So what he was asking you when, did you try your hardest? I said that to my son once in seventh grade. He was writing a paper and it was so hard for him. And I said, just do your best. And he said, Mom, I'm in seventh grade. I don't know what my best is. And I thought, you're right. In seventh grade, I didn't know what my best was either. And I said, you know what? You can work. Do you feel proud of it? Do you
Mm.
feel proud of your work? So there are two ways that researchers find we can experience pride, something called authentic pride, which is when we know we've done the best we can do. And then there's extrinsic pride when we get an A on a paper or a pat on the back by a teacher. We can foster authentic pride in our kids. We can teach them by helping them get a PhD in themselves and us getting a PhD in them. We could see what their strengths are. We could help them use those strengths to overcome failures, to overcome obstacles, and to build up that authentic pride that I think your dad was instilling with you and asking, did you, just do your best? So, one of the things we can do really concretely is what I just said, get a PhD in your kids. What does that look like? It's seeing what is unique about who they are. And this was very hard for me. And so I discovered something called the VIA survey, which stands for Values in Action Survey. Was developed by the two leading positive psychology researchers, Christopher Peterson and Marty Seligman. And it's been validated, scientifically validated. It's a free online survey. There's an adult version, there's a kid version. As a family, we took it all. We all took it, and we got to see what our natural strengths are. And so, what I try to do in my house is I try to get a PhD in my kid, see what their natural strengths are, and encourage those strengths. Help my kids use those strengths to overcome obstacles in their life. So that's one way of developing that authentic pride is really knowing who we are deep inside. And how do we do that? We get to know what's unique about us. What are our strengths? And as parents, we can point those out. So I know I'm talking a lot. One more
No,
thing I'll yeah.
no, I was just gonna say, so when I mean, you have 3 totally different children, and it's amazing when you have kids to know that they came from the same 2 people most of the time, and you're like, "How are you so incredibly different?" And it's really hard not to say, like, make comparisons or to keep everyone in the same lane and going the same direction. I love that because I think finding their differences and building those up as as their strengths allows them to be their own individual person, not comparing themselves. They're already going to compare themselves to the outside world because the natural world, as we talked about, is super competitive. But I hate that there would be competitivity in a home, and I know that finding getting to know your children versus trying to develop them in a specific direction is way better at building up that authentic pride you're talking about. So, with your 3 kids, what were some of the differences that you saw, and how did you support their independent, authentic pride to be their own little person? Or they're bigger now, but their own big person.
3 children could not be more different. My oldest son is very scholarly, very serious, has actually a great sense of humor, loves The Office, and has that kind of humor. That's sort of the 3 thing that's the thread. The humor is the thread between my kids. My daughter is very funny, high EQ, can read a room like nobody else. And my youngest is an extraordinary friend. He's a huge people person, and can read people like a book very quickly. So how do we celebrate these strengths in our home? So this was a phrase I got from a psychologist, Rick Weisbord, and it's really sort of changed my parenting. The self becomes stronger less by being praised, which can feel like pressure, and more for being known. So, what we do is I don't praise my kids. I call out their strengths. So, for example, on our birthdays, we go around the kitchen table and we say one thing we love about the birthday boy or girl. And it's never like, I love that you're doing so well in AP calculus. It's like, I love that on a cold day, you're thinking about your little brother and you're telling him to put on a coat, it's cold out. Or that when you have homework and your sister's struggling with an assignment, you'll put down your work and help her. And so we go around the table and we talk about the things that we value about that person. And another way, teachers are very good at writing up your kids' strengths and weaknesses. And so what I've taken to doing is annotating my kids' report cards. They'll say something like, William, my oldest, he's always the first one to raise his hand to offer to help a classmate. And I'm like, I see this too with your siblings. So just pointing these things out, really getting to know them for who they are, appreciating their humor, appreciating how kind they are to the neighbor, not praising them necessarily for it, just noticing. I see how you are with our neighbor. I saw how you picked up her newspaper and brought it to her. That's so kind. So things like that.
I think those are great examples because I can already see, the differences in each of my children. I mean, Julian's really young, but he just like lets those boys do whatever they want to him. And it's just easy going, go with the flow, happy go lucky. My middle guy's the silly guy. He's also very sensitive and super loving. And then Sebastian is that quintessential big brother who he's loves the sports, wants to play, wants to get good grades, wants to, I'm the oldest of 3, so I know the pressures of he knows it makes us happy when he's happy and excelling. But I want to, being that I was the oldest of 3, I kind of want to untangle it even more for him so that he can feel free, or maybe I'll just model like my dad, the failures that I've had along the way, because there've been plenty. And I am happy to share those.
I think just like living our lives out loud. It's what I find myself doing is like when I make a mistake or I forget something, or what, I'll talk out loud and I'll say, I know better than this. Why did I do that? Why? And then I'll say, you know what? I've beaten myself up enough. Time to move on. And I'll let them hear hear how I think through things out loud. Like when I'm working and I'm at home and I'm working on an article, I'll literally say out loud, well, that's enough for the day. Like just teaching them my thought process.
So healthy. It's so healthy. And just that modeling, I love that. Just living our lives out loud. That's a great tip. So when you talk, it reminds me of you talking about healthy interdependence in a home. Can you expand a little bit on that topic and how we can develop that?
Yeah. So, we're often told as parents that the ultimate goal is to raise self reliant, independent adults. And that is certainly a worthy goal. I want my kids to be able to go out in the world and survive when I'm no longer around. But the parents of the healthy strivers had a more profound goal, and that was not just independence, but interdependence, meaning knowing how to rely on others and how to have others rely on us in healthy ways. So, what does that look like? It's realizing that for any goal that you're going to set, it's pointing out for your kids. So, I'll give you just real concrete. My son was struggling in Spanish, and so he went in early, multiple days before a test, and he did well on his test. So he came home and he said, Mom, look, I did well. And I said, That's awesome. I said, How do you think you did it? And he was like, Well, I worked really hard. I studied really hard and da da da. And I said, Yeah. I said, Do you think the fact that your teacher came in early every morning, left her kids to come and help you do better on your test, do you think that had something to do with it? And he'd be like, Yeah, you're right. So pointing out the other people in their lives that help them become their best and normalize it, right? We don't have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, which by the way is like not even possible if you've ever tried it. I have for the book. I wanted to see what is it like to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Really hard to do. So my point is, we want something. If we really want to give our kids that safety net, that when we're no longer there, that we know that they can be caught and thrive. It is really the skills of interdependence. Learning how not to worry alone. That's a mantra that we've adopted in our family since writing the book. That's something from Ned Hallowell, who's a psychiatrist. And, it's advice that he gives parents to never worry alone. And it's advice that I also give my kids to never worry alone, because that's when we get into trouble. And so knowing we are worthy of support, knowing we are worthy of people listening to us and guiding us, that's the kind of skill we want to give. And to give our kids the skills to help people become their best selves. So that's interdependence.
I'm sure you've seen it in the research, but as these young people become more and more connected to social media, it feels more alienating. And what, the highlight reel of their friends or the people they're quote unquote competing with in life, it feels like M and maybe I'm just thinking that this is what their experience would be, and I have no idea, but it would feel like that if you're looking at other people succeeding, it looks like they're doing it on their own, and you need to figure it out on your own, and you need to be successful on your own, and you need to know everything already. I would say one of the biggest things that's been a success driver for me is tapping other entrepreneurs and tapping other nutritionists and leaning on the functional MDs in my space to support them for free in the beginning of my business or shadow them or work with them to understand like how to build my business and how to build my career. I would never have been able to do this just by jumping on Instagram and building a blog. Like I have so many people to thank for the success of my business and I can't imagine doing it alone.
Right? What a lonely life to think that you need to go at this alone. And so what's really important is building our kids' sense of self, the idea that they don't have to do it alone, that there are people in the world that want to help them, and that there are people in the world that are going to need their help too, and how to teach them how to show up for the people in the world who need their help.
This is This has been such an inspiring podcast already, and I can't wait for your next book already, and I'm so excited that you wrote Never Enough because there is such a toxic achievement pressure that's happening in schools today, in our families, in our communities. So I want to leave our audience with some tips that you have to develop a healthy achievement culture in your home, and what we can do to minimize that toxic achievement for our kids. Like what have you done? What are like those tried? I'm going to use the dollar one. I'm going to crunch it up all the time. I'm going to model that behavior, but what are some other things that we can do?
I'm really thoughtful now. So these are all I am not a perfect parent, just to put it out there. And but I learned so much in researching this book. So um, criticism impacts our kids. Researchers find it 5 times deeper it hits them than any one compliment. And so I try to keep this ratio in my head that when I'm giving them feedback, to make sure to really separate the deed from the doer. It's not that you were lazy and you didn't study for the test. It's that what was it about, your week that really didn't support you studying for this test? How can we do this together? How can I help you? So being mindful about how I criticize and really to try to minimize it. I also prioritize affection. So one psychologist I interviewed said we should greet our kids once a day the way the family dog greets you, with total joy, right? The dog isn't thinking, oh, you gained some weight, or, oh, you didn't do well on that math test. So just so much of our lives as parents is getting through a to-do list. I make sure at least once a day for my kids to see the joy that I actually get from being their parent, and I let them see it. Um, those are two big, if you could minimize criticism and prioritize affection, those are two huge things. The third thing I would say is prioritize chores, and don't call them chores. Talk to our kids. In order to matter, our kids need to hear the messages that they are valued for who they are deep inside, but they also need the social proof that they matter to people other than themselves. And one way of doing this at home is through chores. Again, don't call them chores, it can backfire. Instead, you can ask them, once a week, we have these family meetings in our house, a quick 10-minute meeting where we talk about family matters, things that need to get done that week. And so my kids will offer, I have teenagers, so my son will go and he'll pick up food at the grocery store because we live in New York, so we can walk to places. Asking your kids to contribute, letting them see that they can make a positive impact on the family well-being. And also, several of the families I met in the book had a volunteer mandate. So a lot of families have sports mandates. We don't care what you play, but you have to stay active 12 months out of the year. A lot of the families I met who were raising the healthy strivers also had a volunteer mandate. They said, just part of being our family is once a week, we're going to do this for an hour together. Every family has 1 hour a week that they can devote to adding impact to the world around them and showing their kids how they can make a positive impact, because that feeds mattering. Messages of mattering feed it, but seeing how you yourself can make doesn't have to be big, a small positive impact on the neighbor, bringing in her newspaper because she's elderly and it's hard for her to walk. Little things like that.
Those are it feels like easy tips, and the minute you can push away the competition, it wouldn't matter what the math test is. Of course, you're not going to criticize the math test. They don't want to get a bad grade. They just want hugs and kisses. They want to feel like they matter. They want to be involved. It's interesting because I know that Sebastian always wants to help. Like, Chris has the leaf blower out and he's like, "Can I do it? Can I broom? Like, can I chop the veggies? Can I be?" He's always, and we give him free reign in our kitchen, in our house, to like help us. And there's a Richard Scarry book where there's a little Kenny bear in it. And Kenny is a bear, and he like brushes his teeth and puts on his clothes and makes his breakfast. And we call him Kenny bears in our house, not chores. But my husband will say, "I have to do my Kenny bears." And Sebastian's the first to be like, "What are you doing? How can I do it?" And we'll let him use the big power tools. And he has kids' knives, and it's getting him involved it sparks so much independence and pride, that authentic pride. What has been hard, and I'd love your advice, is with my second, he has had a lot of things, just here's dinner, putting it out in front of you. Here are your shoes. We'll help you put them on. And it's almost the speed of life where you end up just doing for the second as fast as you can because you're trying keep up with the schedule or get to school or get dinner on the table. What advice do you have for ensuring that every member of the family has this that matters? And
Yes.
in comparison to their siblings too. I don't want Toshin to compare himself to Sebastian and not feel m- as that he matters as much, if if not more. I want all of my kids to find that their place in the world.
So Alfred Adler is he's passed away, but he was a contemporary of Freud's. And he came up with something called the family meeting. In his mind, it was a 20-minute meeting. In my fast-paced mind, we make it a 10-minute meeting. And here's how you can address that issue in your house. For 10 minutes once a week, each person in that meeting, you, your husband, the three kids, even bring the baby in there, um, you're all equals in that moment. You are all power with, you're sharing your power. Here are the family matters. Here are the things in our family that need problem solving, we need help. So here's a little thing that you could do in your house. So in one of our family meetings, I brought up the fact that we live in an apartment and our closet is 10 steps, not even 5 steps from the door, and yet none of the shoes ever make it in. And so I said to my kids, help me problem solve this. We have a mountain of shoes at the front door. Our guests trip on them. It doesn't look nice. What can we do? And so my son said, here's the issue. When we're running for the bus, everybody just kind of throws their shoes in the closet and we can't find them. And so we'll miss the bus. So that's why we all leave them outside the door. And I said, well, what can we do to solve that? And he said, well, why don't I go on Amazon and buy a shoe rack? And he did. And now they put their shoes on the shoe rack. And that was a problem solved. Little kids can solve problems and they can feel the impact, the positive impact they can have on their family well-being. So have those 10-minute meetings, make them 5 minutes if that's all you have, and ask each person to problem solve the little issues that are coming up in your daily life.
I love that so much. And you're gonna have the LeVeque family doing 10-minute family meetings where Tashin's coming up with all of our solutions. And the baby's just going with the flow. It'll be great. Oh my gosh, Jenny, this was such a joy. I can't wait for your next book. I'm so excited about this topic. I want our children to go out in the world and do really big things. And I do not want achievement, toxic achievement pressures and being perfect and competing to hold them back from taking risks and feeling their worth and that they matter. And your work just, it's so important because for these young children with the privilege that they do have, they can do really big things to help other people who don't have those advantages. And I'm really thankful for your work. So thank you for your time and for all of your MeSearch. It really means a lot.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Well, where can people follow along? Where can they grab your book? Where can they find your next one? When is it pub? All of
Yeah,
it.
great. So you can follow me on Instagram where I try to give daily tips on fostering cultures of mattering at home and at school. So that's at Jennifer Wallace. You can buy the book Never Enough wherever books are sold. And the next book on mattering will hopefully be done in a year and a half, and then will be published then. But I'm busy at work writing and researching, and boy, there's so much that matters about mattering.
Well, we'll have you back for that so you can teach us all how to cultivate it in our adult life and continue to support our children. But thank you so much. I'll put all of the links in the show notes. You guys go grab Jenny's book, Never Enough. It was a phenomenal read, and it makes me emotional to think that these kids don't know how much they matter. Your work is so important.
Thank you, Kelly.